Last month, I watched a senior engineer present a flaw in a critical design. His evidence was a page of equations, just clean and undeniable. The room was silent. Then, a manager from a different department spoke up, and he didn't address the math at all. Instead, he asked if the engineer had considered how questioning the design might make certain team members feel, less included. And the conversation, it didn't turn to stress tolerances or safety factors. It turned to perceptions and protocols. And the engineer's data just sat there untouched, like some kind of relic from a different age. What struck me wasn't the disagreement itself, it was the complete shift in the rules of engagement. We were no longer in a realm where, physical laws were the final arbiter. We had quietly crossed into a territory where the authority of reality itself was suddenly up for debate. And I couldn't stop thinking, this isn't just happening in conference rooms. I mean, the plane you board, the software securing your data, the bridge you drive over, they are all right now caught in the exact same silent collision. And that anecdote, it's so much more than just some corporate dispute, right? It's a perfect, almost chilling encapsulation of what we're really diving into today. The core problem is this. We've built these incredibly complex, high-stakes Western systems, aviation, infrastructure, medicine, that rely entirely on objective competence. Yet the governing logic inside these very institutions is increasingly shifting away from that objective truth and more towards subjective experience and ideological conformity. So our mission in this deep dive is to make a kind of clinical diagnosis. We're not really interested in the politics of it, but the pragmatic consequences of this silent collision. We want to investigate the structural mechanisms and the empirical evidence behind how these institutional mandates are affecting competence, resilience, and, well, ultimately, public safety.
Exactly. We're looking at what the sources diagnose as a pervasive competence crisis. And to really get our heads around this degradation, we have to treat it as a systemic failure, not just a bunch of isolated incidents. So our analysis today is going to be structured across, let's say, 4 pillars. We have to start with philosophical groundwork. And that means looking at the pretty unexpected dystopian origins of the idea of meritocracy itself. Then we'll move to the sociological analysis, detailing how certain ideological frameworks, particularly wokeism, can act as a kind of solvent on open discourse and objective screening. And we'll ground all of this in critical evidence, detailed high-stakes anecdotes from sectors like engineering and medicine where the stakes are literally life and death. And finally, we'll look at the legal response, specifically federal guidance, detailing how these administrative bureaucracies like DEI offices can risk crossing the line into unlawful discriminatory practices. The core theme running through it all is the price you pay when ideological conformity starts to supersede objective performance.
Okay, so let's start right where all the resentment and, frankly, the hubris begins, with the whole concept of meritocracy. When we use that word today, it almost universally means a good thing, right? A system where talent and effort let you rise, no matter your background. It sounds like the very definition of fairness. We have to go back to the source. The term was coined in 1958 by a British sociologist named Michael Young, who titled his essay, The Rise of the Meritocracy. And here's where it gets really interesting for you. Young didn't invent the word to describe an ideal society. He wrote it as a profound satire, a really grim forecast of a technologically advanced dystopia.
That forgotten origin is absolutely the key piece of context. Young defined merit as IQ plus effort, a pretty rational system on its face, designed to make sure that the most intelligent and hardest working people rose to positions of power. But his warning was profound. He predicted that this system, far from leading to social harmony, would breed 2 distinct and very toxic social ills. First, the elite, the successful ones who scored high on that IQ plus effort scale, they would develop what he called meritocratic hubris, a deep, unshakable arrogance that told them they had earned their status entirely on their own moral desert.
So they would become completely intoxicated by their own success. They wouldn't see themselves as, fortunate stewards of some natural skill, but as inherently superior individuals whose status was a moral reflection of their own goodness.
Exactly. But the second, and maybe even more devastating moral casualty, Young predicted, was the underclass. These are the people who, in a supposedly meritocratic society, are tested and measured again and again, and inevitably some get labeled as dunces or failures. In an aristocracy, if you fail, you can blame the system, you can blame fate, but in a meritocracy, if you fail, you can really only blame yourself. Young predicted they'd be left with this deep, demoralizing, and really unflattering reflection of themselves. They internalize the failure as a lack of merit. The problem, therefore, isn't the competition itself. It's the moral judgment that competition imposes on the losers.
That sounds, it's a total mind-bending paradox. Meritocracy promises to be a friend to equality, right? It replaces the fate of your birth with competition based on talent. Yet the critique suggests that the very promise of fairness actually makes the social divide worse by turning structural inequality into a personal moral failure. So if merit is the goal, why do political philosophers argue against it as a foundation for, moral desert?
Well, the critique really boils down to two main philosophical objections to this claim that successful people morally deserve the vast rewards they get. The first one is the contingency of talent. This argument basically says that having the specific talents that let you succeed is just a matter of luck, of good fortune. Think about it like a sporting analogy. If we had a perfectly fair race, everyone gets the exact same training, same equipment, same nutrition, the person who wins is still the person who happened to be born with the best genetics, the highest lung capacity, the strongest muscles.
So the winner can say they tried the hardest, but they can't claim they're morally superior because their baseline advantage was just a gift of nature. That's a huge distinction. It argues against the whole idea of the self-made person.
It absolutely does. You earn the rewards through your effort, sure, but you didn't earn the ability to earn those rewards. And the second objection, which is just as powerful, is the moral arbitrariness of market demand. This is the recognition that your success depends entirely on living in a society that happens to value the specific talent you possess at that exact moment in history.
Wow, that one hits hard. Because the value of my skill is transient. It's like worshiping transient market fashion.
Precisely. We can use the example of LeBron James. He's a phenomenal athlete, justly rewarded today with hundreds of millions of dollars because we live in a globalized, media-saturated society that puts a massive financial value on professional basketball. Now, imagine LeBron had lived 500 years ago during the Renaissance. His physical talents would still be prodigious, but society prized different skills, maybe the ability to paint frescoes or navigate the sea or build clockwork. His earning power and social status would have been drastically lower. His talent didn't change, but society's need for it, the market demand did.
So when I look at a high-earning software developer today, their success relies not just on their effort, but on the pure cosmic luck that they were born during the digital age, when their specific ability to write code is prized above, say, the skill of a master cabinet maker.
It's luck, multiplied by luck. You're lucky to have the talent, and you're lucky to live in a time that pays handsomely for it. And once you recognize that, the philosophical foundation for claiming that you morally deserve those vast accumulations of wealth over someone else becomes incredibly shaky. Yet we know that successful people cling desperately to that moral justification.
And that's the dark side, Young predicted. The winners believe their success is purely their own doing, and the necessary dark corollary is that the losers must equally deserve their fate.
And the closer a society gets to the idea of equality of opportunity, the idea that we all started on the same line, the more toxic that hubris becomes. If the system is truly fair and I still failed, it must be because I'm inadequate or unskilled or simply one of the dunces. This weaponizes inequality. It turns economic difference into a personal moral failing, and it deepens the divide between the college-educated elite and the working class.
I think we have to pause here, because this isn't just some abstract theory. This philosophical need for moral justification fueled real-world economic policy.
It absolutely did. The sources connect this meritocratic outlook directly to the rise of neoliberal globalization in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. As deregulation, tax cuts, and financialization rapidly widened the gap between the ultra-rich and everyone else, the winners needed a moral narrative to justify their outsized share of the wealth. They couldn't just say, well, the rules changed or we won. They had to say, we won because we're better, we're smarter, and we worked harder.
And the political rhetoric just followed suit.
Absolutely. When that wealth disparity grew, they needed a sociological framework to maintain stability. And that's why you see political figures like Lawrence Summers, an economic advisor, making these incredibly brazen statements. He suggested that the rise in inequality was because people were finally being treated closer to the way that they're supposed to be treated. That statement, it's not about economics, it's a declaration of moral desert. It perfectly crystallizes the meritocratic hubris that Young warned was coming. A system where the lucky few believe their place at the top is, well, divinely ordained by their own merit.
Okay.
So the meritocratic philosophy created a moral justification for inequality. But for that philosophy to actually take hold inside institutions, it needed a structural mechanism. And this brings us to the decay itself. the process of institutional capture. If the winners believe they deserve to manage society, they will reshape the systems of management to look just like them.
And you describe this capture not as some sudden dramatic revolution, but as a bureaucratic siege. It's a slow bleed orchestrated by administrative growth.
It's very subtle and highly effective. Institutions designed for core missions, like teaching, engineering, or research, are slowly taken over by administrative bureaucracies. Primarily HR and these specialized offices focused on compliance, social metrics, demographic representation, often all grouped under the umbrella of DEI. We have data showing the growth of this administrative staff in universities and corporations, and it far outpaces the growth of the technical staff, the people who actually do the core mission. This administrative class gains enormous power, not through competence in the mission, but through control of process and compliance. And the process effectively becomes the product.
And if the product is process, the quality of the actual technical output starts to drop, leading to what's been called the tyranny of the mediocre.
This is where the consequences become systemic. When the administrative bureaucracy controls the hiring and promotion filters, the entire institutional imperative shifts. Excellence, rigor, the ability to solve hard, objective technical problems. That all becomes secondary to managing social risk and ensuring ideological compliance. The system is no longer screening primarily for competence, it's filtering for compliance. Furthermore, mediocre leadership, which has often risen through this compliance-focused administrative track, has a systemic fear of truly superior talent.
Because superior talent exposes the mediocrity of the leadership.
Exactly. Superior talent asks the uncomfortable questions, upholds objective standards, and refuses to cut corners for the sake of process. So mediocre leadership, to secure its own position, instinctively purges that talent. They either make the environment unbearable or they outright fire them through performance reviews based on social metrics. This whole process creates a systemic downward spiral, systematically cleansing capability and depleting what we call the competence reserve.
Okay, what exactly is the competence reserve and why is its depletion so catastrophic for complex systems?
The competence reserve is the deep, often unmeasurable reservoir of experience, rigor, domain mastery, and institutional memory that these complex, high-risk systems rely on when things go wrong. It's not just the checklist. It's the senior engineer who knows what's wrong before the computer tells him. It's the pilot who can fly the plane when the automation fails. It's the decade-long memory of how the power grids survived the last crisis. These systems are inherently fragile, and they require a deep margin of error, that reserve, to survive non-standard, unforeseen events. When you systematically filter out the most rigorous, technically astute, and least compliant individuals, you are essentially drawing down that reserve. The system looks fine on paper, but the margin of safety, the distance between normal operations and catastrophic failure, just got infinitesimally smaller.
And the shift in screening also plays out powerfully in the emphasis placed on credentials, which brings us right back to the philosophical groundwork of meritocracy. The political rhetoric that encouraged rising was always tied to education.
We heard it constantly. You can make it if you try. And what you earn depends on what you learn. That sounds uplifting, doesn't it? But it created an immense credentialist bias and fueled the diploma divide. When the political and corporate elite constantly valorize the four-year degree as the only path to success, they are implicitly insulting the vast majority of the population who do not have that credential.
Right. It effectively says if you're struggling economically, it's because you didn't value education enough to get the degree, so your struggle is your own fault. It's the meritocratic judgment applied to labor itself.
And that is deeply divisive. Nearly 2/3 of Americans do not hold a four-year college degree. By treating the degree as a necessary condition for dignified work and social esteem, the elites fostered deep, justified resentment among the working class. They felt that the people making the rules, the college-educated elite, were oblivious to their reality, prioritizing finance and abstract knowledge over the skills required to actually build, fix, and maintain the country.
And we saw how complete that capture was in the political realm. I mean, the sources point out how the Democratic Party's base shifted dramatically over decades, becoming the party of the college-educated professional class, leaving behind that blue-collar base that once defined it.
Look at the novelty of the 2020 election. Joe Biden was the first non-Ivy League Democratic nominee in 36 years. That single statistic demonstrates how intensely credentialism has concentrated power in the hands of a small, highly educated, and self-selecting elite. They govern based on a worldview that is completely foreign to the vast majority of workers.
Representative James Clyburn's critique of this trend within his own party was incredibly sharp. He criticized candidates for focusing too much on how smart they were, rather than connecting with the concerns of working people.
Clyburn asked, "What does this constant push for college mean for the people who want to be electricians or plumbers or barbers? It implies their work is inherently less valuable, less dignified, and less worthy of respect." And this systemic bias is reflected in governance itself. If you look at Congress, 95% of the House and every single senator holds a 4-year degree. Contrast that with the working class, which is half the U.S. labor force, yet constitutes less than 2% of Congress members. This ensures that the structural problems benefiting the highly credentialed, like the continuous financialization of the economy over manufacturing, go unchallenged, reinforcing that initial philosophical injury of meritocracy. So we've established a philosophical justification for elite arrogance and a structural mechanism of decay, this bureaucratic capture that hollows out institutions and depletes the competence reserve. The institutions are now weak, brittle, and they're filtering for compliance over competence. This is the moment when the sociological solvent, often broadly referred to as woke culture or wokeism, arrived.
That's a crucial transitional point. It's not that the sociological movement caused the structural decay, but that it filled the vacuum left by the collapse of objective meritocratic standards. Before we get into the collision, what are the strengths of this framework that the sources acknowledge?
Yeah, it's important to give credit where it's due. The movement, which is centered on intersectionality and social justice, has brought about undeniable positive change regarding awareness and transparency. We saw this momentum accelerate with the hashtag #MeToo movement, shining a necessary light on systemic sexual misconduct and power abuses. Similarly, initiatives like mandated gender pay gap reporting in the UK increased transparency and drove change. And the Black Lives Matter movement certainly raised critical awareness of systemic racism and police brutality. Its focus fosters empathy and solidarity, which are important social goods, especially for historically marginalized communities.
Those are tangible impacts on social awareness, for sure. But when this framework enters the professional, technical domain, the core challenges start to emerge, particularly when it comes to truth-seeking and open dialogue.
Right. The first major challenge is the tendency to stifle open discourse. In professional environments, whether we're talking newsrooms, academia, or corporate boards, individuals become increasingly hesitant to express nuanced, dissenting, or critical opinions. They fear being labeled intolerant or bigoted or insensitive. This isn't about winning an argument. It's about the professional risk of being perceived as causing harm.
That creates a chilling effect where ideological compliance becomes a form of self-preservation. It is safer to be silent than to be precisely correct if precision risks offense.
And we've seen concrete evidence of this in media institutions, which are supposed to be dedicated to truth-seeking. The internal struggles at outlets like the BBC or the New York Times show that the fear of internal staff backlash over perceived offense can completely override the journalistic mandate to publish complex or uncomfortable truths. The James Bennett resignation, for example, after he published an op-ed that many staff felt promoted harm. Well, despite the piece being structurally defensible, it showed that the organizational imperative had shifted from editorial standards to managing staff feelings. When that happens, productive debate just vanishes.
So that's at the organizational level. The second challenge the sources highlight is the focus on identity over collective goals.
A relentless focus on individual experiences and identity markers, while necessary for addressing discrimination, can limit the potential for systemic change by focusing inward. Instead of prioritizing broader social and political concerns necessary for collective reform like addressing economic systems that hurt everyone, the focus narrows to an us versus them mentality based on immutable identity. This fracturing limits the possibility of the cross-identity coalitions needed to achieve large-scale systemic change.
And this leads us to the most dangerous aspect of this sociological shift for safety-critical systems, the disintegration of trust in hard sciences. This is the moment where the inviolable logic of objective truth clashes directly with the postmodern narrative that privileges subjective experience.
This is the collision at the core of your opening anecdote. On one side, you have the 2 + 2 = 4 of physics, structural integrity, biological reality, and mathematics. These are immutable laws. On the other side, you have an ideological framework, which suggests that reality itself is a social construct and that subjective lived experience holds a higher moral authority than objective empirical evidence. When this relativistic view enters technical professions, engineering, medicine, aviation, it acts like a pathogen.
The dangerous belief is that sheer human will, or maybe ideological fervor, can somehow supersede gravity or biology.
It leads to the terrifying scenario where an engineer or a medical professional prioritizes ideological comfort over biological or physical reality, and the immediate consequence is that public trust disintegrates. When people see, or rationally suspect, that technical professionals are being selected for demographic metrics over objective mastery, the fundamental covenant of trust just collapses. Why trust the bridge design if the engineer was chosen for compliance rather than competency? Why board the plane if the pilot was hired for representation over aptitude? When competency is actively sacrificed for ideological alignment, the institutional pursuit of social engineering inadvertently dissolves the social glue that allows complex, risk-laden cooperation to function in a modern society.
So now we move from theory into the cold, hard test of reality. The stakes for this collision are most visible in these safety-critical sectors. Aviation, for instance, cannot negotiate with gravity or fluid dynamics. Its foundation has to be absolute meritocracy and precision. The evidence suggests that even just the perception of a lowered standard in this field is catastrophic.
That's exactly right. Aviation operates on razor-thin margins of error, which are buffered by that deep competence reserve we discussed earlier. When policies intended to boost demographic representation, things like quotas or fast-track preferential hiring are introduced, the risks are immediate and profound. The sources highlight that these policies risk lowering selection standards and, critically, eroding the internal trust within teams. A co-pilot must know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the captain has a requisite skill, and vice versa. If there's a perception that certain colleagues were selected via a different, non-meritocratic filter, that institutional trust breaks down and the safety margin diminishes dangerously.
Let's unpack that crucial story of Miller, the senior mechanic. This anecdote is a perfect illustration of how the system prioritizes ideological comfort over institutional rigor and how it erodes that competence reserve.
Okay, so you have to imagine Miller. He's a lead mechanic, been with a major U.S. airline for over 30 years. He has all this institutional memory. He's the guy who knows the history of every recurring fault, the human error patterns, the silent language of the aircraft. He's overseeing a new recruit hired under a highly visible fast-track initiative that's emphasizing demographic goals. The recruit is tasked with routine maintenance on a critical hydraulic pump in the wing housing. The work is precise. The torque settings are non-negotiable.
And what happens when the technical challenge exceeds the recruit's actual competence?
The recruit makes a fundamental and very dangerous mistake. He over-tightens the bolts and strips the threading on the pump housing. This is a major safety violation that compromises the integrity of the hydraulic seal. Worse, because he fears professional reprisal under the intense pressure of this initiative, he seals the panel back up silently, hoping his error will go unnoticed.
And that's where Miller's institutional knowledge comes in. He doesn't rely on a checklist. He relies on 30 years of experience.
His internal clock, that deep reservoir of competence, alerts him. He just knows the job was completed too quickly, and he detects this almost imperceptible misalignment on the panel. So Miller opens it up, finds the stripped threading, and immediately understands the catastrophic risk that young mechanic just imposed on the next flight. He flags the safety violation, corrects the error, and confronts the recruit sharply about the ethical and professional breach of sealing up a known fault.
And what is the organizational response to the man who just saved the plane?
Miller is immediately called into HR, and they don't want to hear about the hydraulic pump. They don't want to discuss the integrity of the threading. The interrogation focuses entirely on his tone, his language, and whether he created a hostile work environment for the new hire. The new hire who felt singled out and unsupported by the senior mechanic. The organization's priority has completely inverted. Managing the ideological optics of the program is more important than upholding the objective safety standard. Miller is reprimanded. 3 months later, disillusioned, he takes early retirement. And the airline loses 30 years of irreplaceable operational rigor, knowledge, and vigilance, all because the structure protected compliance over competence. The margin of error just got drastically thinner.
That structural failure is horrifying because the cost isn't paid right away. It's paid during the next unforeseen anomaly when Miller isn't there anymore to catch the silent mistake. Let's look at a similar collision in healthcare, where the objective truth of human biology is the bedrock of clinical success.
This medical anecdote, which was recounted by a teaching resident at a university hospital, is incredibly revealing. It happened during Grand Rounds, which is a critical educational session where complex patient cases are discussed. The case involved a patient whose presentation of symptoms and specific biological markers pointed clearly to a sex-specific medical condition. This condition, by its very nature, only occurs in one biological sex. However, the patient identified differently.
So the objective biological truth was in direct conflict with the patient's expressed subjective identity.
Exactly. When the attending physician opened the discussion for a differential diagnosis, asking the residents what condition was most likely, the room full of highly trained, extremely bright residents went completely silent. They knew the clinical pathology, they knew the objective biological facts required for a correct diagnosis, but they were completely paralyzed by sociological pressure. They were terrified that stating the necessary biological fact that the patient's condition was sex-specific would be interpreted as a political transgression or a form of microaggression, or even an act of intolerance.
The fear of being socially or ideologically disciplined actually outweighed their primary objective duty to the patient, which is an accurate clinical assessment.
It demonstrates the chilling effect of ideological management taking precedence over clinical pathology. Empathy and respectful language are crucial in medicine, of course, but if medical training prioritizes ideological comfort over biological reality, the risk of misdiagnosis increases dramatically. A virus, a cancer, a sex-specific hormone imbalance. It doesn't care about political sensitivities. If a doctor cannot state an objective, immutable fact necessary for a diagnosis because they fear a professional inquiry, the patient loses. Competence is compromised by compliance.
The ultimate non-negotiable check on this entire systemic decay is what the sources call reality's veto. Ideology cannot suspend the laws of nature.
And this is most brutally illustrated in the critical infrastructure scenario, which demands absolute adherence to physics. Consider a regional power grid control room during a massive, record-breaking heat wave. The system is under unprecedented stress. The chief engineer, the veteran with decades of operational grit and crisis management experience, has recently been replaced by an appointee who was selected primarily for ESG alignment and social metrics, rather than deep domain knowledge.
So we have a leader who is politically savvy but operationally brittle, managing a system that is right near its breaking point.
The grid begins to peak dangerously. Equipment is overheating. Warning indicators are flashing red. The necessary, unavoidable action, the only way to prevent a catastrophic, widespread system failure, is to initiate a controlled, rolling blackout. This is politically unpopular, it will cause a public outcry, but it preserves the infrastructure. The new chief engineer, focused entirely on political optics and preserving their reputation for social success, substitutes social engineering fantasy for the physics of the grid. They believe they can delay the action, hoping the heat breaks or somehow demand magically lessons.
They prioritize the political short-term over the immutable long-term reality of thermodynamics and system integrity.
And that delay is fatal. Because the necessary action was not taken, the system trips. And it's not a managed rolling blackout, it's a catastrophic, cascading failure that destroys equipment, leaving millions without power for weeks, not hours. Reality always gets the final vote. Ideology cannot suspend the laws of physics. When authority is decoupled from competence, and when social risk management supplants operational rigor, the essential infrastructure we all rely on becomes fatally fragile. The system fails not because the equipment was bad, but because the human in charge prioritized the wrong set of metrics.
So the systemic erosion driven by these internal institutional shifts, particularly when they're pushed by administrative mandates, has rightfully attracted severe scrutiny. We need to look at the legal framework that governs these practices, which acts as a check against this kind of ideological overreach. What is the fundamental legal principle that dictates caution in programs labeled as DEI?
The foundational legal principle in the United States is actually very simple. All Americans must be treated equally under the law. Federal law, specifically Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which governs federally funded entities, and Title VII, which governs employment, strictly prohibits discrimination based on protected characteristics like race, sex, color, religion, and national origin. And the critical legal guidance is clear. DEI programs, no matter how benign their labels or objectives might sound, are not exempt from this scrutiny. If they use protected characteristics in a discriminatory way, they violate federal law and risk severe penalties, including the revocation of federal funding.
So the intention of promoting diversity doesn't override the legal requirement of non-discrimination. Let's get into the specific categories of practices the legal guidance identifies as potentially unlawful. We should start with unlawful preferential treatment.
Unlawful preferential treatment occurs when an entity provides an opportunity, a benefit, or an advantage to individuals based on a protected characteristic, while disadvantaging other qualified individuals. The guidance warns against using race or sex as a factor in selection or allocation. A strong example would be race-based scholarships or exclusive programs. For instance, establishing a scholarship fund that is exclusively available to students of a specific racial group, even if the intention is to promote diversity or correct historical imbalances, is legally problematic because it explicitly discriminates against students of other races.
And this extends directly into hiring processes as well, right?
Yes. Preferential hiring or promotion practices are unlawful if a policy mandates prioritizing candidates from underrepresented groups, defined by race or sex for hiring, admission, or promotion, thereby bypassing equally or better qualified candidates who don't belong to those specific groups. The key is that the decision cannot rest, even partially, on the protected characteristic.
Okay, let's address a more subtle area that is becoming increasingly common in universities and corporate settings: the prohibited use of proxies. This means criteria that appear neutral on the surface but actually function as substitutes for protected characteristics.
This is where the legal analysis has to penetrate the surface rhetoric. A proxy is an otherwise facially neutral criterion that is intentionally used to correlate with, replicate, or substitute for the explicit consideration of race, sex, or other protected characteristics. The guidance specifically warns against requirements that demand candidates demonstrate things like cultural competence, lived experience, or cross-cultural skills in ways that are specifically designed to evaluate a candidate's racial or ethnic background rather than objective necessary qualifications.
Could you give us a clear illustration of that? How does a requirement for a diversity statement cross the line?
A classic example involves requiring applicants, especially for faculty or senior roles, to submit diversity statements, detailing how their cultural background informs their teaching or professional contributions. If the entity then uses the content of this statement to provide benefits or advantage based on the applicant's race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, it acts as an illegal proxy. They're essentially evaluating and rewarding the protected characteristic through the back door, using the statement as a substitute for explicitly asking, "Are you a member of this demographic group?" The application of the criterion, not just its existence, is what creates the legal violation.
And finally, what about the environment itself? What practices constitute unlawful segregation?
Segregation involves organizing programs, activities, or resources in a way that separates or restricts access based on protected characteristics. This reinforces stereotypes and creates unequal treatment. The clearest examples include race-based training sessions, like a university mandate that requires participants to separate into race-based groups, a black faculty caucus or a white ally group, and explicitly prohibits cross-participation. Even when the stated goal is promoting inclusion, the act of mandatory separation and exclusion based on race is legally problematic under Title VI. Similarly, designated facilities like a BIPOC-only study lounge may facially discourage access by others and foster a hostile environment for those excluded based on their race.
So the legal guidance is a crucial reminder that the pursuit of demographic outcomes can't come at the expense of established civil rights laws designed to ensure equal treatment for every individual. What are the best practices recommended to organizations that are striving for inclusion while also staying legal?
Well, the recommendations are focused entirely on restoring objective, colorblind criteria. Organizations must focus solely on skills and qualifications directly tied to job performance. They must prohibit demographic-driven criteria in all hiring and promotion processes. They should eliminate diversity quotas, replacing any policy that mandates specific representation in candidate pools with processes that evaluate all applicants purely on merit and objective performance metrics. Furthermore, they must rigorously avoid exclusionary training programs that stereotype or penalize individuals based on protected characteristics. Training should never require participants to affirm specific ideological positions or confess to personal biases or privilege, as these are often used to create hostile environments or impose penalties for dissent, which violates federal law. #tagoutro. Our journey through these sources, it paints a consistent and alarming diagnosis of the competence crisis. This is a systemic, self-inflicted wound where systems built for objective excellence are now filtering for ideological compliance and comfort. This process, initiated by meritocratic hubris, amplified by credentialist bias, and formalized by bureaucratic capture, results in institutions that are fundamentally hollowed out. They're failing their core mission, whether that mission is designing safe aircraft or maintaining a functioning power grid.
And the implications are structural and existential. The evidence is clear. Any society that actively sabotages its own meritocratic principles and systematically purges its competence reserve in pursuit of ideological purity is destined to fail the reality test. They will be outmaneuvered, not just by external geopolitical competitors who still prioritize pragmatic competence and rigorous talent cultivation, but by the unforgiving laws of physics, biology, and system complexity. This isn't just a political debate, it is a foundational crisis of systemic integrity versus demise.
To counteract this gathering entropy, the immediate focus has to shift dramatically. The path forward requires moving beyond the philosophical preoccupation with distributive justice, debating how to simply redistribute goods among different identity groups, to affirming the dignity of work through what's called contributive justice.
How would you define that shift simply for the listener?
Contributive justice is the recognition that every person's competent contribution to the common good, whether you are the plumber fixing the nation's infrastructure, the nurse providing care, or the engineer designing the next chip, holds inherent value and dignity, regardless of your elite credential or lack thereof. The immediate task is to begin constructing parallel structures in education, in professional networks, in private enterprise, where the seed stock of competence, sanity, and respect for objective reality can be rigorously defended and cultivated. We have to remember precisely why the regression began and affirm the fundamental principle that objective performance must, ultimately, be the only measure that matters in safety-critical systems.